next training video in Matthew's Gospel, The Call of the King, chapters 8 to 13. We're now in chapter 11, and we're going to look at the king being doubted and rejected, really. And this is going to be a progressive development throughout Matthew's Gospel. We're going to actually feel from chapters 11 and 12 and onwards a growing intensity and opposition and resistance to Jesus. And that makes these chapters incredibly important to us. So please read verses 1 to 24, look at the dialogue, and hopefully this training video will help to give some clarity. But remember your leader's guide, there's far more detail in there. But let's get into it. Looking at the context, it's very important to understand what's been happening so far, because out of the blue, we suddenly hear about John again, John the Baptist. And we need to remember John's message and situation, what we've discovered and learned about him so far. And in the beginning, Matthew chapter 3, we do pick up that John's introduced as a very fiery preacher, and his picture of the Messiah, the coming Messiah, is quite intense. As you hear, there's lots of judgment themes in it. See what he says, even now the axe is laid to the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Notice the fire language. His Messiah's winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor and gather his wheat into the barn, but the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. So notice the expectation, judgment, the separation of evil, or the eradication of evil from his kingdom. And really, this is in line with the Old Testament prophets and their expectation of the age of the Messiah or the coming of God. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, with the recompense of God. He will come and save you. Now keep Isaiah 35 in mind. And maybe you've wrestled with Isaiah already in your study guide and group guide, if you recall. But something happened. Yes, Jesus is announced as, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased," at his baptism. But straight after that, we read John, or after Jesus' temptations, is that John had been arrested. And if you read the other Gospels, you'll know why. It's because the king didn't like his message. And that's where he stays throughout the whole Gospel. And so we can sort of understand why, when we look at the next part, he asks a question. After Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, who went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. So again, he's in Galilee. He's not even going towards Jerusalem at this stage. And when John, who was in prison, he's still in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" Because at this moment, it doesn't look like there's an axe that's being wielded, or a winnowing fork that's separating the chaff from the wheat. King Herod is still on the throne, who arrested him. The wicked religious leaders that he confronted are still the religious leaders. Rome is still the oppressive regime controlling this region. And so it's really understandable, his question. And maybe it's a question you've asked yourself. Why, if Jesus is the Messiah, is there no justice? Or this reigning of righteousness and the eradication of evil? And hopefully this pricks your curiosity and attention to hear Jesus' answer. And the first thing Jesus does in verses 4 to 14 is explain who he is, and how we need to understand him, and who John is. And the first thing Jesus points out is he is the Messiah showing mercy. See what he says, "Go and tell what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up. And the poor have good news preached to them." Notice the commonality here. People who are broken, destitute, who are suffering the consequences of a broken, fallen, sinful world. And Jesus really pointing out that, look, this is also the expectation of the Messiah in the Old Testament, because if you read a little bit further on in Isaiah 35, the same section, you read this, "Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy." And so Jesus is actually correcting John, but in a very gentle way, and pointing out that there's more to the Messiah than just judgment and the eradication of evil. Jesus has come, and if we remember what we've read so far, Matthew chapter 1, verse 21, he's come to save his people from their sins, not to destroy them because of their sins. He has come to rescue them. He's come to cleanse them. He's come to reverse the effects of the fall. And so Jesus ends with a gentle warning. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. Blessed is anyone. Yes, he has come to show mercy and grace and to restore his people and to rescue them from their sins. And may this never be a reason to stumble. And it's a reminder to us today, when we consider today, that we live in an age of injustice and violence ourselves. But we need to keep in mind that this is the age in which the Messiah is showing mercy. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise of judgment and coming and eradicating evil, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance, because the wages of sin is death. If Jesus had to come in the sort of one-dimensional way that John proclaimed, then the expectation, well, the reality is everybody will be destroyed. Everybody will perish, because everyone is in sin, including John. John and everyone needs Christ's mercy, his grace, his restoration, to be saved from their own sins. And this is what we need to keep in mind. This is the age in which the King of God's kingdom is extending his terms of peace and grace and mercy towards rebels. But before we depreciate who John is, Jesus reminds us who John is. He's the messenger of the Messiah. And then he reminds the crowd, he turns to the crowd, before anyone has a low view of John. He says, what did you go out into the wilderness to see? Because a lot of people went, by the way. There was a great commotion and excitement about him. Did you go see a reed swayed by the wind? Notice he would ask this 3 times, by the way. If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? Some king or politician or famous person or fancy person? No. Those who wear fine clothes are in king's palaces. Then he asks again, then what did you go out to see? Notice the emphasis. A prophet? Yes, I tell you. And more than a prophet. Yes, he is a prophet, but he's more than a prophet, and this is why. It's his role. This is the one about whom it is written, I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you. And later on he'll say, if you're willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. Whoever has ears, let him hear. Remember this little phrase. But notice the claims, and these are very important claims. He is the messenger who will prepare the way before the Lord. He is the Elijah which Malachi spoke of, who will come before the great day of the Lord. And just to refresh you, here is the passage. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. Now, very interestingly, and you can go do this comparison yourselves. You go back to 2 Kings 1:8, I think, is compare Elijah with John. And so you'll discover it's not coincidental that John dressed the way he did, lived in the place he did, ministered in the place he did, ate in the way he did, spoke in the way he did. Everything he does is literally like Elijah. He's a carbon copy, in that sense, of Elijah. And so here we see the fulfillment. He is the messenger who's prepared the way for the Messiah who is going to show mercy to his people. And so he's a very significant character, but fascinatingly enough, I want you to see something. Truly, I tell you, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Why? Because remember, he's the transitional figure. Notice what he says, for all the prophets in the law prophesied until John. This is what makes him great. He's the great and last prophet of the Old Testament, the great transition figure between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant ushered in by the Messiah. And yet he says, this is the beautiful part, whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Now this has got nothing to do with the role, but rather with the privilege or position or status we have. It's because everyone after John who believes and trusts in Jesus will be heirs to the kingdom, if you recall the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5. And there's no greater privilege, no greater honor than to be a citizen of Jesus' kingdom with Jesus as king. And in that sense, we are greater than him, because John's role was transitional and temporary. But the inheritance of the kingdom and having Jesus as king, that's eternal. And so Jesus gives us, although this is a phenomenal privilege, Jesus also gives us a reality check of the age we are living in, the age of the Messiah, the age of mercy. He says, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been subjected to violence, and violent people have been raiding it. And so notice what Jesus is saying. If you recall Matthew chapter 10, is the mission of Jesus and what his disciples should expect on this mission. Jesus is saying that his arrival at this stage, when he's showing mercy, is not going to change the cycle of violence and persecution and opposition that we've observed in the Old Testament, that we've observed in John the Baptist's life being arrested, and it will continue in this age. And so Jesus is setting us up to understand that in the age of him showing patience and mercy and grace and restoring his people and saving from their sins, those who do not respond will still act violently and wickedly. And so we shouldn't be surprised by this. In fact, John's arrest is a precursor for what we can expect by following Jesus. But here's the tragedy. If this is true, if Jesus is the Messiah and John is the messenger, this is exactly what Israel has been waiting for. The real question is, how have they responded? How have they responded? And Jesus explains Israel's present response in verses 16 to 19. And it's tragic. He does it with a parable. To what can I compare this generation? They are like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling out to others. We played the pipe for you and you did not dance. We sang a dirge and you did not mourn. Notice that the children are acting in the wrong way, meaning they're responding in the wrong way. Played the pipe for you, they should be dancing, but they don't. We sang a dirge, which is a sad song of lamentation, and you did not mourn. They lack the proper response. And so Jesus is pointing out that this generation of Israelites that he's ministering to, that he's showing mercy towards or extending mercy towards, they're not responding. They're not responding in the way they should. In fact, we see in the rest of this passage, the end, their reasons for why they're non-committal. They're not following or responding to John or Jesus. So when John was there, when John came neither eating nor drinking, a very ascetic, strict lifestyle, they found reason not to follow him. He has a demon. Basically, he's spiritually disturbed. We shouldn't be listening to him. We shouldn't be responding to him, dancing or mourning. And then he says, well, when the Son of Man came eating and drinking, the exact opposite to John, which we see in Matthew's Gospel, they found reason not to respond to him. Here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. He's a wild one. But notice how they're contradicting themselves. And the point is simple, is that they're finding all sorts of excuses and reasons not to respond to the music, not to dance, not to mourn, not to come to Jesus. And as we'll discover later on in the end of this chapter is verse 28, not to come to him and find rest. This is the tragedy of Israel's present response here in Matthew's Gospel. And yet, as Jesus points out, is that wisdom, he acquaints himself with wisdom in Proverbs. The wisdom, the source of life, is proved right by her deeds. In the end, he will be shown true, and their assessment and excuses for not following him or listening to John will be proven false. And sadly, it'll also be to their detriment. It'll lead to their destruction, which Jesus then points out the future consequence of their response in verses 20 to 24. And actually, it's here where we see Jesus pick up the threshing or the winnowing fork and the axe and pronounces really, or as you see here, he starts denouncing the towns in which most of the miracles are performed because they did not repent, they did not respond. And we need to listen to these warnings as well. Notice the repetition. Woe to you, these different Galilean towns. Woe basically meaning calamity. judgment upon you, dread upon you. Why? Because notice what Jesus does. He does it with Capernaum as well, Chorazin and Bethsaida, where he'd done these miracles. And then he contrasts these Jewish towns with these Gentile towns, Tyre and Sidon and Sodom, that we read of in the Old Testament. And he points out that it would have been far better for them never to have heard the message of mercy and grace and the terms of peace than to have heard it and then not respond and reject it. But I tell you, it will be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than for you. And notice this, how shocking if you think about Genesis 19. But I tell you, it will be more bearable for Sodom on the day of judgment than for you. And because they have rejected Jesus and not responded to him, they won't be lifted up to heaven as they would have hoped. No, you will go down to Hades, which is the place of the dead. To reject Jesus, the wisdom of God, the source of life and light, is to embrace the opposite of him, which is death. And so here we actually see the judgment that John the Baptist was speaking of being pronounced upon these towns. And this is the tragedy of Matthew chapter 11, verse 1 to 24, is that here is their hope, their Messiah. Everything is falling into place. It's the age of grace and mercy. The king is extending his terms of peace. And they're not responding. And sadly, it will lead to that day when they will be cast away into the fiery furnace, when the axe will come down, and when that day comes, it is too late. And so really what we need to walk away with from this passage, and you can look at your leaders' guides, is see who Jesus is in the age we live in and understand it and why we still see wickedness and evil today, but simultaneously see the urgency of sharing the good news, but also the urgency of responding to Jesus, to come to him. Because a time will come when this is over, and when the time of peace is done, and when Jesus, the great physician, closes his door. And when that day comes, it'll be too late. When the winnowing fork is ultimately applied, there's no turning back. So now is the age to hear the music and to respond in the way Jesus wants us to. And that, I think, is the message of Matthew chapter 11, verses 1 to 24.